Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Driven to Abstraction, Proust's Impressionistic Art. Man, one of those amphibious creatures who are plunged simultaneously in the past and in the reality of the present. For man is that ageless creature who has the faculty of becoming many years younger in a few seconds, and who, surrounded by the walls of time through which he has lived, floats within them as in a pool, the surface level of which is constantly changing, so as to bring him within range of one epoch, now of another. Marcel Proust, The Fugitive. Hi everybody, and you're going to have to be gentle with me today because I have the most fatal of diseases, man flu. So if I keel over halfway through, it's how I would have wanted to go. So thank you for all your support. Anyway, today I wanted to look at, as you can see, Proust, but with specific regard to various artists. And the idea of today's talk is to provide an overview, because in coming weeks I'm going to do the whole pile of videos on Proust, but so as not to put you off, just by way of explanation. In the 6th volume of À la Recherche de Temps Perdu, In Search of Lost Time, roughly, I'm trying to think from my edition, about 250 pages from the end, there's about 8,500 words he writes about the nature of art. And I thought in future weeks I'd systematically go through and just pick out the best quotes. There's some brilliant stuff in there. It's like an 8,500 word manifesto about how Proust saw art. And for this channel, I think it's a gold seam that illustrates and illuminates lots of other types of art. So today, the last few videos have been quite word heavy. So this is going to be image heavy. And I want to provide an overview of some of the future weeks. And it'll start with Proust, both this video and future weeks. Then we'll talk about Impressionism, and then particularly Monet, but all of it is aimed to providing the groundwork for exploring abstract art, which, I'll be honest, in the past I've never really enjoyed. But as I've been doing more and more research on the topic, I've become a bit smitten, so hopefully I can persuade you. And someone once said, or I read somewhere, I can't remember, the idea that when people say they're bored with a novel, or they don't like a novel, or they don't like a particular type of art, more often than not, they're not ready for the art. It's not that, it's the art's not ready for them. And I found that with abstract art. I just wasn't ready for it, and now I think it's bloody wonderful, some of it. So anyway, we'll try and get there. And I just wanted to pick up, before we dive into the images, literally and metaphorically, so to speak, this idea of amphibious creatures, which I think is a lovely phrase, who are plunged simultaneously. So there's this notion of plunging that Proust refers to. And then later on, floats. And these are separated by quite a few paragraphs, these two quotes, as far as I can remember. But the idea of, so there's plunging in the first one, and then there's floats within them as in a pool. So there's the amphibian and the aqueous. There's this definite notion of water, which unsurprisingly has quite a lot of relevance to Monet, who famously did the water lilies, but I'm going to argue is much more significant than just that. But talking about the water lilies, this is from the custom-made gallery, the Orangerie in Paris. I think there are 3 rooms from memory. I think originally there was supposed to be 2, but unless I've misremembered, I think there are now 3 rooms, and the light is designed, as you can see, to spill in. And I'll confess I've never been. I would absolutely love to go. The thing that stops me, because, Paris isn't that far, it's I have a morbid fear of tourists. So if I ever managed to get my hand on a few £1 billion, I would just rent the place out for a week and spend it on my glorious own and away from, mobile phones and loads of people in the way. But that's just me being misanthropic. But I hope you can see here the concept. It was deliberately designed so that these big arched paintings they're set very low. So apparently when you walk in, you get this submerged, this plunging, as the previous Proust quote says, but you're plunged into, you get this almost physical sense of being plunged into water. And then this is a Renoir, and I've picked it because it's the Grenouillère, the frog pond. Excuse me, talking about frogs. One in my throat. But this is Renoir, and Monet and Renoir painted almost exactly, well, pretty much exactly the same scene. So this is Monet's version. And if you can just try and keep this in your mind's eye to see the comparison. This was Monet's. And what I'm going to say now, and all the other slides that I'm going to talk about, I just want from the get-go be clear. These are both, I'm talking about Proust in the title, Proust's impressions, but they're my impressions, so I'm not claiming any profound authority on any of this. Part of what I want to talk about are my subjective responses to encourage you to do the same, to see what you pick out of some of this stuff. So just to repeat, I'm not claiming it's any objective, authoritative analysis. It's more just to show you some practical illustrations by means of my impressionistic responses, to show how Proust's, in the material we'll look at in future weeks, how Proust's material relates to all this, and how we individually respond to art over time, which of course is the major theme of his book In Search of Lost Time. But to stop wittering, this painting, I think its major difference with the previous one is the blackness, the darkness in the foreground, the colour contrast. I want to talk about Renoir in future because to lots of people he's just far too chintzy. It's like china teacups and biscuit tin painting. It's too chintzy, which is partly true, but there's Renoir, aspects of Renoir which I think are a bit more disturbing and worth looking at. But in this, it's the right hand corner. I'm just fascinated by the darkness. And if I go to the previous one again, you see there's a little bit of darkness but there's a boat taking up most of the space. And I think what Monet does more than Renoir is put more water between you and the scene, but it's this notion of plunging. There's a barrier of the boats here that Renoir provides. So it's almost as if the viewer could be standing in one of these shallow boats. Whereas there's a boat on the left, and I suppose there's one right in front of us. But at least on the right, contradicting myself, at least on the right you can see that there's more of a sense of you could plunge into that, and you don't get quite the same sense. And it's the darkness which is a theme I want to develop as we go along. There's something about the right hand side, the shadow of the boating house, and how Monet presents it. And I think it points to Monet also, like Renoir, can sometimes be a bit, cover of a biscuit tin type of an artist. But sometimes I think there's a darker side to him. So that was what I'm going to try to do today. Well, what I am doing today is I'm going to put the titles in after. I'm trying this out because I just find titles and dates quite distracting from the main thing we want to look at, which is the paintings. But I also appreciate people want often the dates and the full details. So at the end of every like little discussion, the details hopefully will come up for the vast majority of the paintings we're looking at. So this is Monet's famous garden and an actual photo of the Japanese footbridge. And he did a whole series, and this is the problem with Monet. If you want to talk about his paintings, he did painting after painting after painting of often the same topic. So if you try, I was trying to pick out certain paintings, and it's just, you're just tempted to pick out loads of examples of the same thing. But so what I might do in future is just have separate videos on separate series that Monet did. But this is from the actual garden, and what I wanted to do here was contrast. Obviously this is a photograph, and then to show what Monet does with the art of painting to this photograph. And you may not have seen this particular version because there are lots of quite accessible, inverted commas, nice, pretty paintings he did of this bridge. But the one I'm about to show you is from very late on. I think he died, was it 1926? I think this was, he always worked on lots of paintings at the same time. But I'm pretty sure he was working up till about 1925 on the following one. And I just think that's great in terms of it's. If you weren't familiar with this particular painting, you might be forgiven for thinking it was a very modern abstract painter. And I doubt, unless you'd seen it before, you would immediately associate that with Monet. But I think it's a great example of some of the things I want to talk about in relation to Proust. Because it's so unlike the actual photograph. And in a world in which we're absolutely, talk about plunge and submerging and amphibian creatures, we're absolutely drowning in photographic images. Whereas this, as in lots of art that I want to discuss, takes you right into the depth of reality rather than surface level photographs. Oh, I said 25, didn't I? He was working up till 25, so I was a bit out. But so as I said, though, he worked on this for quite a while, amongst a pile of other paintings at that time, just before he died. And I mentioned, you know, you could be forgiven for thinking it's an abstract painting by a much more modern painter. So here's an example of such a painting to compare and contrast with. And this is Jackson Pollock, Jack the Dripper. And interestingly, this there are bits in the actual painting, and this is one of the frustrating things, that unless you can see it in person, it's got massive texture, and it's much deeper than just a surface level painting, because he whacked on the paint, but also he included, I think there's tacks, cigarettes, coins, lots of dribs and drabs from his pockets. He actually embedded in the surface of the painting and then painted over. So it obviously adds a lot more texture and depth than just a plain easel, flat easel surface. And that's full fathom 5. And the title comes from, I've mentioned this in a previous video, I'm sure, but just to reiterate, because I want to underline the point I've made previously, the title comes from Shakespeare, The Tempest. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones a coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. And in the previous video I did on, very early on in the channel's existence, on the girl with a pearl earring, I make the point, I did I think 2 or 3 on Vermeer's girl with a pearl earring, And I make this point about the pearl, for starters, the pearl earring is not a real pearl. And then obviously a key aspect of that painting are the eyes of the girl. And the pearl, the link, why I'm linking these two paintings is the idea of those were his eyes, because there's an obvious association with the pearl that isn't a pearl earring she's wearing and her eyes, and how Vermeer is, both of them mutually illuminate each other. And then again in a previous video, it was Richard Evans, I think, one of the who made a comment on the channel about, he asked about the blackness or the darkness to the woman's left hand side as we're looking at her right hand side as she's standing there, but the left hand side as we're looking at it. And I think Richard was saying that if you didn't have that blackness, and if the face wasn't situated exactly the way it is, that the blackness achieves something. And so we had a brief discussion in the comment section, but to me, it's the darkness makes that painting. And in the previous video, I lambasted the modern tendency to fill in all the details about this woman in the international film and the best-selling book they made about this painting. But the true art of this is the extent to which it relies upon the darkness on the left. And the link I want to make is, this is where abstract art comes in. So I'm not saying Vermeer was an abstract artist, but he definitely, that blackness to the left, or the darkness. This is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, where you can sit and just become absorbed, like again to quote Proust, an amphibian creature, and lose yourself in the depth of these paintings. And what's so ironic is that, again, I think as I've got older, I find travel narrows the mind, so I don't travel very much anymore. But if I ever get off my backside, I really want to go to Houston, Texas. I believe this summer it was damaged, the chapel was damaged in the hurricane, and it's for the indefinite future it's being closed. But hopefully they'll get back on their feet. But the idea that there's an irony that so-called abstract art, that for many people isn't real art, you benefit so much from seeing it in person, because there is lots of depth, there is lots of subtlety, even in black paintings like this, and you just don't get it from a reproduction or a computer screen. So the irony or the paradox for me is that so-called abstract art really needs your physical, concrete presence to get the most out of it. So this is about Monet. It's an article by William Sates, or Setz. The magnificent seascapes of 1885 and 1886 done at Etretat and Belle-Île tremble on the razor edge where vision meditates between the world out there and the inner experiences of the mind, sensibilities and emotions. And then this is Monet himself being quoted in the same article. I am enthusiastic about this sinister region, and justly, for it takes me away from what I am in the habit of doing, and moreover, I confess, I have a great deal of difficulty in rendering that sombre and terrible aspect. It's pointless for me to be a man of the sun. And that's an appropriate note for me to poke my miserable face in. But I am also not a man of the sun. As a friend in the long time ago once said, I am whiter, or he accused me of being whiter than Dracula's bum. But this, I wanted to emphasize, first of all, sets his distinction he makes on the razor edge where vision mediates, Freudian slip, mediates between the world out there and the inner experiences of the mind, sensibilities and emotions. That will be a major theme with abstract art, because as ever on this channel, I'm not just going to in future weeks be looking at abstract art for the sake of it. I want to explore it with specific reference to various philosophers. So in particular, Arthur Schopenhauer. And I've already mentioned it in relation to Ian McGilchrist briefly, but this idea of how we relate, we're embodied creatures, and how we relate to the world around us. And there's hints of this. What great artists do is get us to engage with that relationship to the world around us, and that's what's being described here. The there of the outside, but also the inner experiences of the mind, and how the two things mutually constitute each other. It's a key idea in Schopenhauer's work. And Schopenhauer's quite difficult, but I'm guessing, or I'm hoping, that by using art like this, it will become a lot more accessible and understandable. We'll see. But I've italicized and emboldened this particular phrase. It takes me away from what I am in the habit of doing, or with a better intonation perhaps, takes me away from what I am in the habit of doing. I've got a weird intonation today. It's the fever. But habit is a key notion in Proust. So Proust, a massive 2,500 pages depending on your edition, but à la recherche de temps perdu, in search of lost time. It's largely about habit, punctuated by sudden moments of revelation. And Proust has this idea that habit is how we get on in life, obviously. Lots of things are habitual. And it's how we get through life. Although you can't just contemplate your navel and your mortality and everything every single second of the day. Certain habits are what, guide us through. Was it Hitchcock said, drama is, or his films were life with all the boring bits cut out, or that's what drama is, and his films also. But takes me away from what I'm in the habit of doing, and I'm suggesting that is almost a slogan for what art does, by taking us away from our habitual understanding of and engagement with the reality around us. So like I say, in future weeks, future videos, I'll be exploring this in a lot of depth. Excuse me if I keep sniffing. But this is one of the cliffs that was mentioned, and quite a few of the paintings in this area that he did are of this rock structure. But most of them are with much brighter light, because Monet was obsessed with light and light changing during a day. But why I particularly like this is it's the dark and somber aspect he was speaking about. And in the previous video I did on Proust, I think I called it Proust's muscle memory, I read a section where I think it's Charlot as the character. Forgive me if I got that wrong. And he is obsessed with a Vermeer painting, I think it's called The View of Delft. And he keeps referring to this golden patch of wall in the painting. And I like the way Proust identifies, very specific. He was a massive art nut. He loved his art, visual art. And through one of his characters, he's identifying this tendency that people can have, which is to have this notion of an impression, but to have a very small detail sometimes of a painting can stay with someone their whole life. So this Charlot character, as he's dying, he becomes obsessed with this patch of brown golden wall from a Vermeer painting. He sees it as emblematic of everything he was trying to do in art as a writer. And for me, it's the darkness again, which has hints of some of the abstract art, the black squares of Kazimir Malevich, which I've just taken delivery of 4 huge volumes about Malevich, of a huge big study. I think it's about 1,600 pages. So trust me, I'm going to inflict Malevich on you in the coming weeks, or I've wasted my money on that collection of books. So there's the darkness of the rock structure, but also the setting sun. And it's an amazing colour. And again, just to repeat, this is just my impressions. So I'm not claiming there's a direct link. But just to build upon this idea of taking yourself out your habitual way of seeing the world, and that's what these artists can do for you. This is much more miserable. But remember, Monet had this idea of the dark and sombre, and I'd suggest that's in the previous painting. But the colour of the setting sun just reminds me of the colour of this sky from Munch. Sorry, I'm trying to get the. There you go. It's obviously darker in the Munch, but there's something intense about that setting sun and the contrast. And it's also the layering of the colours in this Monet. There's 3 bands which in a minute or two will mention Rothko, but the bands of colour, and also, as you've just seen in the Edvard Munch painting, the bands, the way in which he uses bands of colour. But apologies if that's just my completely subjective association I make, but that's what the Monet painting, it makes me think of Munch-like, angst-ridden paintings like this. And then just keep making these associative links. But here is a Rothko, believe it or not. And I think this is from 1934, which we'll find out in a second if I'm right. And so he was born in 1912, I think. So he would be only 22 when he did this. But again, you see the sun reminds me of the Monet, and also that the whole construction isn't a million miles from the Munch. And that's just, it's quite very early on in Pollock's career. So it's really, it's much more figurative, it's much more figure-based than his later drip-type paintings. There we go, 1934. But then again, I'm just going to show you a painting by Turner. And I'm showing you all these paintings because what I'm trying to do is to provide a background for future weeks when I talk about, and to provide visual references for that very initial quote from Proust about man or human beings being amphibious creatures, not just because a lot of these paintings are about the sea, but also because they require absorption. They require you to plunge into them. And I also wanted just to show again, just to repeat, I'm not claiming all these are necessarily, they were directly influenced, but just to show you some of the common threads. Because I think in the very first welcome video on this channel, I always go back to this quote from Robert Conquest, the idea that culture grasps at us with 1,000 invisible fingers, I think the quote is. So even if artists weren't directly influenced by a particular painting, you don't know what they've subconsciously been influenced by, or what they've seen and not really cognised, but it's come out in their own painting. But this is, I just absolutely love Turner and how far ahead of his time he was. So the previous painting was 1934. I think, again, don't worry, the date will come up. I like to play games with my senile memory to see whether I can remember, and I can't read off the screen because I don't have the right glasses. So I think this was 1812. So, 120 odd years before Pollock. Just the level of abstraction for such an early painter. Oh, sorry, it was way out. 1842. Oh, that's right. It's the next one. I'll let myself off. I'm getting confused with the next painting I'm going to show you, which is from, I'm pretty sure, 1812. But this is from 1842, so this is 90 or 88 years. So my head is just full of cold, so my maths might be out. But the other one was 1934, wasn't it? So that's 88 years difference. But the next one is the one I was thinking of, the snowstorm Hannibal crossing the Alps. And that's this one by Turner. So it's not fully abstract in the sense, compared to the previous one, you have a foreground with identifiable human figures. But if you take the picture as a whole, it's arguably interesting how it can be associated with the following, another early career Pollock painting. Going West from 1934 to 5. But you see the way the mountain crags, it's not a million miles from the previous Turner painting. So I felt perfectly happy with the help of all the sketches and studies. Sorry, I should have given you the background. This is, there's a painter that Proust writes about. He's a fictional character who's an amalgam of people like Monet and Edouard Vuillard, who I'll be doing work on in future also. And he goes in the novel, he goes into his studio, and that's what it's describing. So it's Vuillard, Monet, and a couple of other painters that Proust really liked, and this Elsteer character, the painter, is an amalgam of all of them. But this is the narrator of In Search of Lost Time. I felt perfectly happy, for with the help of all the sketches and studies that surrounded me, I foresaw the possibility of raising myself to a poetical understanding, rich in delights, of manifold forms which I had not hitherto isolated from the total spectacle of reality. And that's a key phrase for me. Manifold forms which I had not hitherto isolated from the total spectacle of reality. So again, what I'm trying to get at, and with all the previous paintings I've shown, and interspersed with these type of quotations, what I'm trying to get to do is illustrate Monet's notion of being taken away from his usual habits. So we're faced constantly with the total spectacle of reality, which, again, in our day, the contemporary times, the sheer number of technologically mediated screen-based images that we're faced with. It's a theme I always come back to, but this idea the total spectacle of reality, and I think Heidegger wrote a long essay called The World as Picture, and it's about this notion of looking at the world, the way which in Western societies in particular, we look at the world as a picture and we consume it with our eyes and with photographs and with constant mechanical and now digital imagery. Whereas what the Proust character, the narrator, when he goes into Elstier's studio, what he's describing is the way in which all these manifold forms which have been isolated from, that's what art does, it isolates things from the total spectacle of reality. And it reminds me, there's a brilliant, Guy Debord was a French theorist, a member of a group called the Situationists, and he wrote a brilliant book called The Society of the Spectacle, which is quite avant-garde, and it's written in short paragraphs that don't necessarily relate to each other in a continuous stream. All the themes are in common. But this idea of society of a spectacle, he's describing much later. Proust is identifying very, very early on, because Proust lived through, the photography was just taking off. In 1848, the first daguerreotypes. So Proust writing about the latter half of the 19th century, and the Impressionists and painters like them were in some ways one of the last flowerings of the art form of painting in response to the deluge, the increasing number of actual chemically produced photographs. So this isolation, or isolated from the total spectacle of reality, this is a theme I'm just going to keep coming back and back and back to. I was able to discern from these that the charm of each of them lay in a sort of metamorphosis of the objects represented, analogous to what in poetry we call metaphor, and that if God the Father had created things by naming them, it was by taking away their names or giving them other names that Elstier created them anew. The names which designate things correspond invariably to an intellectual notion, alien to our true impressions, and compelling us to eliminate from them everything that is not in keeping with that notion. So this is relatively early in Search of Lost Time, Volume 2, Within a Budding Grove. But it's a major theme later on for Proust, the idea that the difference between so-called reality, the reality that we name, the reality that we experience, and by a further analogy, the way in which science approaches the world. By naming, by categorizing, by putting everything in boxes, where for Proust at least, that is alien to our true impressions. So the Impressionist artists, by the very name, gives them away. They were trying to develop more sensitivity to our impressions of humanly experienced, human embodied reality, rather than the falsely categorized, the neatly categorized, more scientific approach to the world. And again, it will be a constant theme in future videos, but the idea that modern contemporary society is dominated by the scientific, rational way of interpreting the world, to the extent that, as Ian McGilchrist consistently argues, we've forgotten, or we're becoming less good at, the left hemisphere of our brains are being spoilt rotten by constant overstimulation Whereas the right-hand hemisphere, the hemisphere that's more to do with metaphors as mentioned here, and patterns, that's being underused and undervalued and underdeveloped. And compelling us to eliminate from them everything that is not in keeping with that notion. Again, that's almost like a slogan for what's happening to our more aesthetic side of our brains in contemporary society. So back to some visual images. So I've used this in a previous video about Giorgio de Chirico, and this is such obviously an inoffensive still life by Henri Rousseau. But it's thought that this may, if not this, a similar type of painting by Rousseau may well have influenced de Chirico's use of colour. And I appreciate, this is quite a nice vegetal green colour in the background. So it's not, I can't think of any Rothkos that use similar type of colour. But the sheer amount, the band of colour, this is what really caught de Chirico's imagination. So I'm about to show you a completely different themed atmospheric painting. But arguably, until he'd seen this, that took him out of his usual habit, to quote Monet again, de Chirico may not have developed this type of approach. Big blocks of colour, so there's big blocky physical structures. The archways that, the porticos that de Chirico was obsessed with. But also, if you forget the physical structures of the buildings, the way he uses colour in huge, big sections. And how that just, it's amazing how relatively simple it is, but how melancholic the atmosphere is that he can create with this type of colour. And it's counterintuitive because normally such bright colours, or at least in the foreground, the sun, would not create a melancholic atmosphere, but somehow he does manage to do it. So then, talking about colour, this is from a Roman fresco in Pompeii. So I think it's 60 to 70 BC. And I love this because it goes towards the continuity of aesthetics across human civilization. So just the tone of the red. And then you see that the central almost columns of they're bordered, but it's like very, very dark plum purple. If you can keep those in mind. But mostly just the redness, the depth of that colour. So the Villa of Mysteries it's from. And a similar, this is a Matisse, Henri Matisse painting that Rothko apparently went to see in New York time and time and time again. And again, the objects are almost incidental, it's just the absolute depth of the colour that apparently made a massive impression on Rothko. So that's from 1911. But back to the Villa of Mysteries. I just find it fascinating, those shapes and colour. And then one of Rothko's most famous paintings. So it's just over 2,000 years separating this from the red of the villa in Pompeii. And this is from an academic article where the writer says, Proust does not deal in concepts, he pursues the idea, the concrete. That this is a Schopenhauerian, that this is a Schopenhauerian, sorry, put my teeth back in, that this is a Schopenhauerian claim for Proust is clear from a passage in the third volume of The World as Will and Idea, which is a book that I'll be going into lots of depth in coming weeks. It's also been translated as The World as Will and Representation. So it sounds technical, but there's not a dispute, there's an ambiguity over the concept of idea or representation and how best to translate the German word for it, which I will go into lots of depth and bore you senseless with it. Excuse me. So I'll explain in future weeks the concept of the idea is being used in a technical sense here. It's not just any old idea. But the author's distinguishing between, and again, this goes to what will be developed in future weeks, the difference in, and I've alluded to already, the difference in science and art. Proust does not deal in concepts, so for the purposes of this discussion, concepts are categories, concepts are regular, definitional approaches to the reality that surrounds us. The idea relates to Schopenhauer's notion of there is will, is almost the best way to describe it, is a life force underpinning reality, and representation stroke idea is how we human beings embodied in the world make sense of this life force called will. We'll see if I can... So whoever is filled with the comprehension of an idea is justified if he chooses art as the medium of its communication. These words, by the way, are directly from Schopenhauer. So, whoever is filled with the comprehension of an idea is justified if he chooses art as the medium of its communication. The mere conception, on the other hand, is something completely determinable, therefore exhaustible, and distinctly thought, the whole content of which can be coldly and dryly expressed in words. A work of art which has proceeded from mere distinct conceptions is always ungenuine. So this is, I've spoken previously about, and there's a whole playlist section about the notion of paradox. It's almost paradoxical, this idea for Schopenhauer, and I've emphasised and italicized this. A work of art which has proceeded from mere distinct conceptions is always ungenuine. So it's Schopenhauer's way of saying that genuine art needs to be paradoxical, it needs to be ambiguous. It's not, earlier on in this paragraph, the mere conception is something completely determinable, therefore exhaustible. So conceptualization, categorization, these ways of approaching the world are designed to reduce things. So in my the logic of the art of paradox video, I gave the example of Willard Quine and the way his analytical philosophy dealt with the concept of paradox. by reducing it, by eliminating it, by conceptualizing incredibly logically and beautifully the way he writes. But once you do that, and this is what Wittgenstein found to his cost, so the Logico-Philosophicus Tractatus that Wittgenstein wrote, he gets to the very end and then realizes, I've been trying to create this purely conceptual language. And there's the famous quote at the end, which I'm paraphrasing badly, whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent. He comes to the deep understanding that actually logic can only take you so far. And this is Schopenhauer's earlier version of the same idea. So what might be perceived as art's weakness, that it only deals with so-called abstract, arty-farty, ambiguous, ethereal ideas, for Schopenhauer and later for Wittgenstein, this is actually art's strength. This is what art does that science cannot do. What I've called in another playlist the Heineken effect. Art reaches the part science can't. Next, there's you're gonna have to forgive me. It's the last big lump of text. Initially, it's from Proust, and it's directly from In Search of Lost Time. From memory, I think it's from Time Regained, the very last volume. It's part of this almost his manifesto on the nature of art. And initially I broke it up. He's famous for writing huge paragraphs, Proust. It reminds me of student essays where they just didn't know how to use paragraphs. So I used to write snarky comments that you are not Proust, use paragraphs. Whereas Proust famously, he does use paragraphs, but they may not be for a few pages. And the following is a whole segment that I will give you in total. So please bear with me, but I just think it's a beautiful expression of the nature of the importance of art. I had arrived then at the conclusion that in fashioning a work of art we are by no means free, that we do not choose how we shall make it, but that it pre-exists us, and therefore we are obliged, since it is both necessary and hidden, to do what we should have to do if it were a law of nature, to discover it. But this discovery which art obliges us to make, is it not, I thought, really the discovery of what, though it ought to be more precious to us than anything in the world, yet remains ordinarily forever unknown to us, the discovery of our true life, of reality as we have felt it to be, which differs so greatly from what we think it is, that when a chance happening brings us an authentic memory of it, we are filled with an immense happiness. In this conclusion, I was confirmed by the thought of the falseness of so-called realist art, which would not be so untruthful if we had not in life acquired the habit of giving to what we feel a form of expression which differs so much from, and which we nevertheless, after a little time, take to be reality itself. So I did apologise. It's a mouthful, but in essence, what I'm suggesting he's saying is that it goes back to the Schopenhauer's distinction between those things that can be conceptualized. So in this case, Proust is talking about the falseness of so-called realist art, because he's pointing to the distinction between things that appear realistic and things that are, for example, painted to be realistic, but they're not actually realistic in the sense that we as human beings situated in the world actually experience things. And maybe the best example I can give of this is, because it's a huge theme in a book called In Search of Lost Time, and in the very final, as the name implies, the very final volume, Time Regained, Proust develops much more explicitly his concept of lost time. But time, and now I'm just beginning to sound like Kamala Harris, and we are burdened by time, but no, seriously, What Proust is talking about is time. If you were going to conceptualize it, it would be like chronological. It would be years and months and dates and hours and minutes. But that's not how you actually experience time as a human being. So the classic example would be when you're a small kid in the school holidays. And in the UK, for example, I seem to remember it was about you got approximately 6 weeks for your summer holiday. And as a young kid, 6 weeks stretched out. It just seemed like eternity. Whereas, obviously, for an adult, 6 weeks can fly by. And there's psychological, arguably, reasons for this. Basically, we're nearer the grave, so... and we've lived a lot longer as you get older, so time doesn't seem to be as long as it does for a small kid. But even for an adult, the whole book, In Search of Lost Time, is riddled with sudden memories. He calls them involuntary memories, Proust writes about. And suddenly he has these involuntary memories and he's a grown adult, but he's taken back to his childhood. So in that sense, realist art is false, because if you as an adult can have a very vivid memory and experience from decades ago and it feels almost palpably yesterday, well, that would indicate that chronological time might be scientifically more accurate, but in terms of human experience, it just isn't. So, in the penultimate or third from bottom line, a form of expression which differs so much from, in other words, art differs so much from what we actually take to be the much more realistic portrayals of reality. So earlier on in the middle of the section, the discovery of our true life, of reality as we have felt it to be, not as it's been categorized, but as it's been felt. An authentic memory. These are all the themes that I'm suggesting using Proust to back me up. These are the themes that visual art is brilliant, and it's why it's no coincidence that the whole of Proust's novel, all 6 volumes, are absolutely riddled in the best possible way with references to visual art. Because you can write, you can use words to describe human experience, but they're only half the story. The images that the book tries to describe all the way through are further complemented in Proust by his constant reference to artists, visual artists, painters, and that previous quote I gave you from the frictional Elstier's studio. I think Proust's a great example of how written literature needs visual supplementation. It needs other art. And I think Proust was really, really conscious of this. But likewise, visual art, the whole purpose of this channel is to trade off and put up against each other visual art and literary art, and to show you how together they add something to each other that the other lacks. But even added together, there's still something lacking, this ambiguity, this taking us outside of our habitual way of seeing the world that can't be neatly explained or conceptualized. Science is great for so many causal explanations, but it cannot explain the paradox-infused nature of human life. So to begin to wrap all this up, this is another Monet. You recognise, if you're British, the Houses of Parliament in the background. But if you just focus on the almost scaffold-like structure at the front right of the painting. So this was from 1871. But if you look at that structure, and then this is the obviously much more abstract Piet Mondrian. I'd suggest it's not a million miles away. Pier and Ocean composition number 10. And then again, this verticality, which is relatively from, I think, I might be wrong, but I think Monet is much more well known for lateral, for horizontal type depictions. But he did this series of poplar trees. And I think so there's the vertical poplar trees, and it's the texture, the way he's got the vegetation at the water's edge. And you've got the obvious contrast between the rigidity, the straightness of the poplars, but the way he's got them going off like an S shape in the background. A lot going on. So that's 1891. And then this final painting I wanted to show you, I just think it brings together the Monet painting of London and the pier, and the Mondrian depiction of piers, and the verticality of Monet here, the poplars. And here you have a Jackson Pollock. So I did say it would be quite impressionistic what I was going to do today, and if you're thinking what the hell was all that about, I will tie it all together. There will be much more structured. I just wanted to give you impressions and some general ideas, and in future weeks I'm going to dive deep down into the basic ideas we've covered today and just do it much more systematically. So I just wanted to make various associations and links today so I could systematically do it later. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and till the next time, all the very best.